And Eli is here. Okay, let's get to it. You do have a quiz. I've decided, I doubt there's going to be enough time in class today. Sometimes the quizzes are done in class. Sometimes they'll be due individually. In this case, I've decided you have a quiz that'll be due before next time. Remind me before we let out today to just give you the overview of that. It's just a simple question that's posted on Canvas, and it'll be on the Malcolm reading you had for today. The language is a bit, the lexicon is a bit esoteric, but you'll get all the words, and that should feel good. You'll understand all the words that are in the quiz, and that should feel good to you, because they're weird words. Anyway, we'll get to that. I want to wrap up where I left off last time with James and Clifford. And then that actually ties in nicely with the Malcolm reading. And then the last one in this section, this area of study, with Pascal next time. Your quizzes, your group quizzes from last time, see them before you leave. Make sure your score that I have written there matches what I put online, that I didn't make any mistakes. If you weren't here for that quiz, you could submit your own responses individually online for partial credit. So please do that. All right. What was W.K. Clifford's maxim with respect to belief? What's an overview of what he thinks of belief? Yeah.
No one should ever, in any circumstance, for any reason, believe anything with insufficient evidence.
Yeah. Oh, he didn't say for any reason, but he says it is wrong. Always, for anyone, to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. The threat, the fear of getting something mistaken, of being a dupe, I think is the term that James will use, should override our desire for getting to the truth. We should be more cautious about making mistakes. Making mistakes epistemically, that is having to do with knowledge, is far more disastrous potentially than happening upon some truth. James responds to this in a number of ways. First of all, he disagrees with the categorical notion that it's always wrong for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. But he doesn't just say you can go the opposite direction and believe any damn thing you want. You can't just, and this is the accusations against him, that you are just advocating for belief in anything. The will to believe whatever you want, whatever makes you feel good, just believe that. Does James say that? No, he has a very narrowly defined set of circumstances that have to be in play, set of conditions for you to have the freedom, and I want to return to that question, because the freedom, remember what I left off with the Clifford article, and I discussed Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, which is not really a secret at all, if you recall, and there were some horrible elements of it logically. That is, for the skeptics, you know what? It's up to them to choose to believe. That phrase is essential to us here, because it sounds like James is advocating for the possibility that one can choose to believe. And we'll see this again with Blaise Pascal. This conception of voluntarism, as it's sometimes referred to, that we can choose to believe something, even if the evidence isn't there, even if it's insufficient. So it's a kind of, if you want, voluntarism versus strict evidentialism. Evidentialism is Clifford's view, right? We have a very high bar for belief. You believe it provided there is sufficient evidence. James says, if I'm confronted with a dilemma, if I'm confronted with a philosophical problem, and I've got opposing viewpoints to try to explain that phenomenon, or if I have a view regarding the immortality of the soul, or whether or not there are souls, or whether or not there's free will, and one side says one thing and the other side says the other, if reason, intellect, logic, argumentation is insufficient to answer the question, if I don't have logical grounds to make the case one way or the other, and it is an option that is what he'll call a genuine option, which means living forced and momentous, then I ought to be free to choose to believe what I want. And what I want is, we'll see how that pans out. Yeah.
When I was reading it, I didn't really understand what he meant by momentous.
Good. Momentous. I chose to ride my bicycle to work today. Is that a momentous choice? I could have driven my Porsche. I'm kidding. I couldn't have driven that. That stays in the driveway. That doesn't come out. Is that a momentous choice, do you think? Does it sound momentous? That momentous sounds like, well, that's pretty impressive. That's a big deal. I'll give some examples later. But so I have all sorts of choices all the time. But if it's not a momentous choice, then the question of whether it's genuine option becomes less relevant. Go ahead.
So is it like saying like the decision that you made is a big decision rather than like, oh, what shoes I'm going to wear today?
Correct. It has to be of special import. I'll give some further details to that. But that's right, because it could be it could be you either it doesn't have to just between two things. I either ride my bike to work, I take a car, I take an Uber, I take a cab, I walk, or I don't go to work at all. And there may be other options there too. I can get a helicopter. There are other options. Go ahead.
Can it just be like unpredictable, kind of? Like the unpredictable? Or
For what?
Like not like something that can't be
I think if I chose to wear red shoes today, it's not like I'm choosing to make a statement that like I'm part of a blood gang or something like that.
Well, that might be momentous.
Yeah, like,
there it matters. That's different. Today I choose to join the Crips. This is part of that's a momentous choice. Or the Bloods in that case. I guess it's a living option. Are the Bloods and Crips still around? So that's a living option. You see what I mean? That's an actual live option in the sense that it's a possibility. Let me give you that. Let me start with that one. The next president of the United States might be an independent. That's a living option. It is logically possible. Somebody running as an independent. Is anyone running as an independent? Sanders. Is Bernie Sanders? No, he's running as a Democrat. But doesn't he call himself an independent? Yeah. Anyway, so if he wins president, it could be that an independent. That's a living option, although it's not likely that an independent, it's usually a Democrat or Republican. It's really a two-party system, de facto, if not by, just ultimately. The next president of the United States will be me, your teacher. Why is that not a live option?
You're under 35. You can't. There's no way.
That's right. Thank you. You stated that well. Well, you read that, but anyway, you see where I'm going. It's not the example he gives, and he's right. He's reading this. James is. This is a presentation he's giving, and this is the transcription. The selection you have from James is a transcribing of his presentation, and he's talking to the group, and the group is comprised of mostly Christians, and he gives the example of it is a live option for you. Anyone in this audience to be either Catholic or Presbyterian or something like that. Those are live options. It may not be a live option for you to be a Mohammedan, which is the way they used to refer to Muslims outside of Islam, because the assumption there was Muhammad was like a Christ figure. That's a confusion. Muhammad is not seen as a divine being in the way that Christ is within Christianity. So Mohammedanism is the wrong term for it, and religious textbooks, world religion textbooks, up to about 10, 12 years ago, kept doing that, which is interesting. But for the audience there, he calls that a dead option, right? It's whether to believe in Zeus or something like that may not be a living option for you. To believe in the God of Judaism, Christianity, Islam or something, that might be a live option. So living, he says, it has like electricity to it. It's a possibility for you. Does that make sense? If the option is between the options that you have, if it's a forced option, right? It's not like there's multitude of options, because then you don't get to. It's not just a matter of a kind of willing to believe. To get married or don't. He says this on page 143. That's the reason I have that there. He says, now let us consider the logical elements of the situation. For example, in the case of the religious hypothesis. So proceeding, we see first that religion offers itself as a momentous option. Actually, I haven't gotten to that one yet in detail. We're supposed to gain, even now, by our own belief, and to lose by our non-belief, a certain vital good. Notice that's language he's borrowing from Blaise Pascal. We'll see later. Secondly, religion is a forced option, so far as that goes. We cannot escape the issue by remaining skeptical. Why do I mention Oprah and Stedman? They've been together for a long time. And I'm told they're not married. Maybe they are married now, and this will ruin the example. Are they married? They're not married, but they're still together. They've chosen not to get married. It's not a matter of, we're leaving the option, right? His example's better, now that I think about it. We cannot escape the issue by remaining skeptical and waiting for more light, because although we do avoid error in that way, if religion be untrue, we lose the good if it be true, just as certainly as if we positively choose to disbelieve. In other words, it is as if a man should hesitate indefinitely to ask a woman to marry him because he was not perfectly sure that she would prove an angel after he brought her home. This analogy doesn't quite work because they're still together, but they've opted not to marry. You might say, they haven't married yet. They're agnostic. Do you remember agnostic? An agnostic for James is an atheist without balls. To use his phrase. It's not James's phrase. You've already chosen. I'm going to wait. There's no middle ground. It's a forced option. You either believe that God exists or you believe that God does not. The middle ground, I'm going to wait, is already to have chosen. Now that may be a point of disagreement for us here. And I don't know if the marriage analogy works.
So he's saying there's like a third choice to not choose?
That is already to have chosen. That's good. To not choose is to choose.
Well,
To refrain from choice. Say, I don't want to make a choice here. I'm going to be agnostic. Oh, guess what? You've just chosen. You have given up, to jump to Pascal next class, you've given up the possible good. By remaining agnostic, you've given up the good that might come with belief. Just as if you were an atheist. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, because you're saying it's between two options. And so if you were to not choose one and not choose the other, that's a choice of
That's right.
just choosing itself.
You've basically chosen atheism. For James, he thinks.
Oh, so he thinks you're choosing the negative.
You choose to believe in God, or you choose that God does not. To stay in the middle and waver, I don't know. For how long can you go that way? And I'm going to give an example at the end for I think that's clearer than this example. He'll say that you've already made a choice on that. And momentous. It's an option that is unique and significant, back to your earlier point. Who should I marry? That's momentous. Do I want paper or plastic? At the grocery store is not. Or is it? Aha.
Butterfly effect.
You see. So it's tough. I'm bringing this up for a point, because what counts as a live option? For whom? Is that going to vary? Does that make it, to our earlier conversation we were having, up to the individual? Because a live option for me may not be a live option for you. Do you see? So my choice, my openness to believe something might be different than yours, because what constitutes a momentous living and forced option could potentially be different than yours. So, to say it in another word, if there are no logical arguments sufficient to convince you either way, and the option is a living, forced, and momentous one, he then changes it instead of the will to believe, then we ought to have the right to believe that which will benefit us. Living, forced, momentous, those concepts we can talk a little bit more about. And I'll give a specific example that he uses himself. This is telling us that reason can't offer the answer. There's not enough evidence one way or the other. We ought to be able to choose what we think will bring us the best, to use his language, cash payout. The cash payout of belief. Those of you from the 203 class from last semester might remember this brief discussion of William James's pragmatism. Pragmatic approaches to belief, to knowledge, to meaning. We establish the meaning of a claim. We establish the truthfulness of a statement based upon the practical benefits it might bring us, the use that it brings us. So, for his own example, my first act of free will, says James, this is James up here, is to believe in free will. And I borrow from Geddy Lee of Rush. Actually, it's not Geddy Lee who wrote most of the lyrics. Any fans of Rush? 2, 3? You all know the sad news of Neil Peart? How ironic, though, if that would have been a Rush ringtone. That would have been actually quite weird. That would have been very strange if I heard Free Will. They have a song called Free Will. And the lyricist was the drummer, Neil Peart, who was a philosophy major. And a lot of his lyrics are embedded with a lot of philosophy, including, I will choose free will, which is a great line. What do you mean you will choose free will? That's what James is saying. You cannot reject any hypothesis if consequences useful to life flow from it. Now you're getting more particularist. Now you're getting more of the individual. If it's for my benefit that I believe that there is a God, then I ought to be free to believe that, provided I don't have any sufficient intellectual grounds either way to tip the scales. I can't decide. There's not sufficient evidence. It's not saying believe in Santa Claus if it makes you feel good, because the belief in Santa Claus has significant evidence against it. Correct? I'm not free. I couldn't tell what you. I'm not free to believe in Santa because the arguments for and against Santa are not equitable. The arguments against Santa, alas, children, are quite stronger than the arguments for. I can't just believe in unicorns because it's a nice idea until you learn more about unicorns, that they drown children. Then you realize, wow, these are horrible things. Look it up. I could be making that up, actually. I don't know. I've never actually investigated that. I've heard that claim somewhere, and I just spit it out now. If you want, you can look that up. I'd like to know more about that, but not enough for me to actually go look into it. Does everyone see what he's saying here? The arguments philosophically for freedom of the will, the arguments philosophically against freedom of the will for James, he claims, are equally good. It's a living, forced, and momentous option to believe in free will. You either believe in it or you don't, he says. So it's forced. It's a live option. We can imagine believing in free will and living as if we had free will, or being determinist. And it's momentous. It makes a difference to your lives. Yeah.
So James is like expanding on Clifford's message, right? It's not like he's refuting it entirely. Because he's saying you should follow Clifford's idea except under these specific...
In most cases, Clifford is correct, but he's too broad. And in fact, it denies a lot. And when we look at the reading for today, Malcolm's conception of Wittgenstein, it goes even further. So there's more of our beliefs than we think of are in fact ungrounded. We don't have rational justification for them, and we do just fine. I'll wait for that in a moment.
Wasn't there the example of like liking someone, and if you say that you're not gonna choose to like, or like you're gonna wait to see if you like someone, you're probably never gonna like them.
Yeah, how do we
try and like them? You're probably pretty more likely to benefit from.
Right. There's a couple things this brings to mind. The philosopher Barbara Walters comes up in her book on kindness. Barbara Walters, the journalist. She's you what?
Is she not a philosopher?
No. I'm just trying to connect it. A little extra clout for Barbara Walters. She doesn't need any more clout. She's Barbara Wawa, I think is what she used to be called from that. She argues that, and she's borrowing from a lot of other people. I haven't actually read this book. My wife read it. The importance of kindness and the importance of assuming, and I think I talked about this last time, that the next person you meet, stranger, whatever, is going to be a kind person, right? Even without evidence for that. This is kind of connected to human interaction. I mean, how do we interact with other human beings? We make immediate blink or Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where we make immediate judgments based on other people's, superficial interpretation of them. We make judgments based on about people based on a number of things. But do we usually make judgments about potential friendships or actual friendships or relationships based on logic and reason and evidence? James seems to imply we don't. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's true, and I don't know if it's accurate, if it's good to base our judgments about other people on more of a kind of intuitive interpretation or a kind of cost-benefit analysis. We saw the movie with the cost-benefit analysis. The dude was a risk analysis guy, and he did pros and cons of dating this girl and this versus this other girl. And of course, obviously, the one of them finds Jennifer Aniston was one of the actresses in it, and what? No. Steve, was it Steve Carell? No, it may have been Steve Carell. Anyway, one of the main guy was a risk assessment guy, and he did the pros and cons. That's not how most people do it, right? Here's the argument for me to stay with my wife. Here are the negatives, here are the positives, and then I bring it to her. Lynn, what do you think of this? Should we give it another 10 years? That's weird. But maybe there ought to be some element. Maybe James is a bit too idealistic here. Yeah? Or too tender-minded, to go back to his distinction. Yep.
I think it was Long Came Polly. With Ben Stiller. Yeah.
Ben Stiller, yes, that's right. And he had a bad spicy food restaurant. He did the risk assessment, and it told him not to go to the restaurant. He went anyway, and that messed up his whole process. Yeah, that was good. I believe it was Ben Stiller and Jennifer Aniston. And by the way, was Brad Pitt, speaking of Jennifer Aniston, was he at the movie thing? Did you shake his hand?
No.
Oh.
Too many securities are out there.
Yeah. Anyway, do you say anything about Jennifer Aniston?
Well, they're getting back.
Are they really?
No, I was kidding.
Oh. All right, on we go. The desire, James says, for a certain kind of truth here brings about that special truth's existence. That sounds like the secret, though. Ask, believe, receive. Doesn't it? But back to your relationship question. Maybe it works in those particular cases. Maybe that's acceptable. And for many religious people, the belief in a God is a kind of relationship. It's a personal relationship. He goes further. His faith acts on the powers above him as a claim, and this is the key, creates its own verification. That's an interesting phrase. It seems to be an instance in which the belief creates, what's the phrase? A self-fulfilling prophecy. You probably heard that. Is there anything to this?
I mean, the idea,
Or is this too strong?
the idea of when you desire something, meaning you want it, you don't just sit idle waiting for it. You tend to take steps to get what you desire. So when that desire is constantly on your mind, that's more than likely going to impact the way you live your day-to-day existence in a way that's going to be conducive of actually having that thing happen. So I think The Secret is just kind of a silly way of talking about that. That's more appealing than
It's more marketed. It's finally marketed.
Yeah.
Philosophers just need to do better marketing. What's interesting, James became very popular taking the idea, borrowing from the ideas of a guy named Charles Sanders Peirce, who nobody knew much about at all. Still, many of you probably never heard of. There's no William James, there's no pragmatism without Peirce. He marketed, if you want, the ideas really well. And I think Rhonda Byrne does that with The Secret. Unfortunately, she goes way too far in saying that we can get rid of cancer just by believing it. James never says anything remotely like that. The idea, because there are arguments on the other side there. James is claiming, however, in certain cases like religion, there isn't, and presumably there won't be, which is a bold claim, reasons sufficient one way or the other to push you. And therefore you ought to, as we did with the free will discussion, you get to choose to believe. And in doing so, it creates its own verification. What in the world might that mean? Consider this.
James Franco.
And here's my joke. See what I did there? For those who know this movie, yeah, I know it's. Oh, that was a sneeze. Bless you. Sorry. Bless you. So you know what's happening here. He's out hiking. I've never seen the movie. You know what? I don't need to. I'm pretty clear what's happening.
What movie is it?
127 hours.
127 hours. He's stuck. Presumably, he falls in a crevice. One of them's with ice, one of them's with rocks. This is a non-iced one, so whatever that is. And I guess a boulder falls, and that's his arm. He's not doing well there. And I don't remember. Is that a watch? He's got a watch. He's got a Swiss Army knife. So if you haven't seen the movie, just know what he's going to do with that army knife. He's going to, no, not the, yeah, why didn't he just try to chip away at the damn rock instead of cutting his, oh. Anyway, this is based on a true story. I think he did break his arm. I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. Why do I even have this up here? This is a stupid example. But let me just jump to it, because I'm not good at this. He has no background evidence that he can sever or break or whatever, remove his arm. He's never been in a situation like this before. In Clifford's sense, he has no evidence that he can survive this kind of situation. I guess he could be agnostic and say, I'll wait until somebody comes to save me. Do you see the point? He waited 127 hours. If he continued to wait, so actually this may tie in well with James's conception of the agnostic. You either believe that you can make it and act as if you and try to verify that, like you were talking about earlier, or give up and say, nope, not going to do it. Or you can, is there a third option here? I'll just wait. I'll be agnostic. I might get saved. Well, we know that I think we knew that wasn't an option for him.
But being agnostic would be the same thing as like giving up.
Yes, that's James' point. Exactly. Precisely.
So was he saying that basically since he's never been in that position before and he has no evidence of him surviving, he shouldn't try to survive? Or shouldn't believe that?
In this case, it's a living force, momentous option. He has no evidence, in Clifford's sense, not sufficient evidence that he would survive. But wouldn't it be foolish for him to be a Cliffordian here and say, I don't have, that's what it would be called, Cliffordian. I don't have evidence that I'm going to make it, so I don't believe I'm going to make it. It's not going to work. Here I go. Or whatever he does to his arm. No. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Instead, what he does probably is psych himself out. I can do it. I can do it. You can do it. To give you an example that is not, I don't know why it was cut. I think it's fundamental to James's point. At the very end of his work, The Will to Believe, he gives an example. He says, I began by a reference to Fitzjames. Stephen, let me end by a quotation from him. What do you think of yourself? What do you think of the world? These are questions with which we all must deal, as it seems good to them. All of us must deal. They are riddles of the Sphinx, and in some way or other we must deal with them. In all important transactions of life, we have to take a leap in the dark. If we decide to leave the riddles unanswered, that is a choice. Back to our earlier discussion. That is a choice. If we waver in our answer, that too is a choice. But whatever choice we make it at our peril. If a man chooses to turn his back altogether on God and the future, no one can prevent him. No one can show beyond a reasonable doubt that he is mistaken. If a man thinks otherwise and acts as he thinks, I do not see that anyone can prove that he is mistaken. Each must act as he thinks best, and if he is wrong, so much the worse for him. Here's the key. We stand on a mountain pass in the midst of a whirling snow. This is where I wanted to go. In the midst of a whirling snow and blinding mist through which we get glimpses now and then of the paths which may be deceptive. If we stand still, we shall be frozen to death. That's agnosticism. If we take the wrong road, we shall be dashed to pieces. We do not certainly know whether there is any right one. What must we do? Be strong and of good courage. Act for the best, hope for the best, and take what comes. If death ends all, we cannot meet death better. You're trapped here. let's imagine, I'm just borrowing from this image, and there's only one way to go. If you remain where you are, you freeze to death. You can't go right, you can't go left because they're too distant or whatever. Going back is death. You can fall into a precipice, that's death, or you can make the leap. Here I'm expanding on it a little bit. It's a leap, it's a jump. It's pretty far. It's not like one you've met before. You're not a track star who is good at the 24 or whatever the big jump is. You have no evidence that you can make that jump. You're probably, however, if you're going to will yourself to believe, in that particular case, it's going to be to your benefit to believe that you indeed can do so, that you can make it. I was going to talk also about Buridan's ass, but we're a little bit short on time. The analogy here goes back to a guy named John Buridan from the medieval period. He imagines, actually having to do with free will, you have two equally appealing bales of hay between this donkey. They're equidistant. There's no good rational reason to pick one over the other. Now, if we're purely rational and rely only upon reason, if it's a rational donkey, if it's a smart ass, if I could, it will die of starvation for failing to make a choice because it's frozen, because there's no good reason to pick one over the other, which really it makes it more of a dumbass if it's going to die in the midst of plenty. So there is, I think, perhaps a connection to the James reading. And by the way, I did post a link to a reading on this analogy as it relates to free will. It's very short, so it's a good supplement with James. Yes, Dominguez?
In regards to the previous picture, is that like considered a forced option, and therefore it's like morally ambiguous whether we can like choose or like?
It is forced in that you either do it or you don't, and remaining stationary, like James Franco in the rock thing, is to have chosen. So it's forced in that there's not a multitude of other options.
So in that sense, if I choose to like make the jump based on insufficient evidence, there's no like wrongdoing.
Oh, correct. He would say in that case, a Cliffordian would be completely wrong and quite foolish. To sum up, Clifford's view, and this is James's language, and I think it's adequate to get what he's saying, to get what Clifford's saying. Clifford's maxim is something like, it's better to risk the loss of truth than the chance of error. Error is worse than the loss of truth. And I forgot to get your question. I'll get in a second. Then the chance of error by believing only what one knows is true. And James's maxim is something like, it's better to risk the chance of error than the loss of truth by believing what might maximize our good. And this will tie us into the reading that we're going to get to now with Norman Malcolm. Yes?
Yeah, and then back to the donkey.
Say again?
It was the donkey picture.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't it be a good reason for him to choose any of them just because if he didn't choose it, then he would die? Like, isn't that a reason to choose it?
Yes, but which one? And so here's the problem. If we rely only upon reason, and there are no better reasons to pick one over the other, the hypothesis is that one might starve in the midst of plenty out of foolishness for making a choice. Now, it's unclear what a Jamesian might say, because here I guess I'm just free to pick whichever one I want. But again, then the desire comes in. Which one do I desire? And what? And how do we ground desire? Where do desires come from? Are desires rational? Are they based in reason? Where do desires come from? Do they come from culture? Do they come from, to borrow from Wittgenstein, the form of life that we all participate in? And if that's the case, what role did I as an individual have in choosing my desires, do you see? Is desire a rational thing? What are desires? We talked about that last time, distinguishing belief from hope. Remember, Jacob, I think you were talking about that? And we talked about our web of beliefs, presumably connecting to reality. Belief is supposed to connect to the way the world is. The beliefs reflect what we take reality to be. Hopes, desires, fears, whatever, those are a little bit different. Our desire, our hope, we start here and try to change this. But if we're intellectually honest, and interested in epistemology and justification of our beliefs, we would want to change this in relation to the way reality is. But it's not an obvious dichotomy. It's not obvious, at least when we look at James, and then when we look at Malcolm. In fact, we'll jump to Malcolm right now. Malcolm's going to be right in the middle of James and Pascal. Malcolm in the middle. TV reference, somewhat dated, sorry. I never even watched the show, but I know the name of it. So that's good enough. What that mental state is and how belief and desire and so forth might interweave. I think it's a fascinating discussion. It could be positive or negative, and we can look at stereotypes where people desire certain claims to be the case, and that affects how they interact with other people. And then perhaps there's a potential worry with a kind of Jamesian pragmatism that could lead to that. How is it we determine that this person's belief is justifiable when they're admitted that they don't have good reasons for it? What happens when one's belief leads to their action, and their action leads to the harm of another person? Do you see? If I don't have reasons for my beliefs which affect my actions, and those actions affect other people, now we're back to Clifford. That does seem to run some moral risk, because I cannot appeal to reasons. We've already dismissed that. There just aren't reasons for it. There's no justification for it. And it's hard for James to escape that, you see. Unless we accept something very different. Excuse me, not very different, but a lot broader in scope with respect to minimizing the need for rational justification for our beliefs. Before I jump into the next reading for today that you had, were there any questions further on James and Clifford?
Didn't ask very well, but would there be any, I guess, any difference between Clifford and James's ideas regarding the individual versus how you're supposed to treat other people versus how you're supposed to treat yourself? Would that even make sense?
Others versus treating yourself? I'm not sure.
What you just said about your actions having consequences on other people.
Yeah.
And maybe then you should hold back on believing something, whereas for yourself, I don't know.
Like how something will affect you?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any differences between those things. Maybe not. Maybe
Well, James did talk about Christian Science, just around that time, and the Christian Science view, science here is in quotes, the view that if one's, and this is fundamental to your point, and I cannot for the life of me recall what James's view on it was. I remember finding it ambiguous. The question is whether or not, to make it a contemporary example, whether or not it's acceptable for an adult to deny her or himself medical treatment and choose only, as with Christian Science, prayer or something like that. And James would be fine with the person making that personal decision, right? What if it's that adult's children? Now, there are legal precedents that seem to allow, in California still to this day, for there to be religious exemptions, and that one can deny, and I'd have to confirm that this is still the case today, I believe it is, they can deny certain treatments to their children based on religious grounds. But children aren't old enough to make these decisions for themselves. You see this with the case of inoculations, and you see this with cases of life-saving treatments that can be denied if I'm an adult. But if I deny a life-saving treatment for my child based on religious ideas, there James, I think, stops. But you know what? I need to look into that to confirm it. I think he does stop there and say, nope, that's not, that kind of action is detrimental to others in a way that's the Franco example, getting out of the rock, or an individual choosing to believe, or an individual choosing to believe in free will, is not necessarily going to harm other people. So that's a good question. I'd have to look more into that to confirm that. Yeah.
So if we talked about tough-minded and tender-minded, so Clifford would be tough-minded and James.
James would be the middle. Right. So Clifford's the tough-minded, empiricism, evidence, kind of pessimistic, physicalist, whereas the tender-minded is the optimist. There's reason, the dualist. There's mind. It's non-physical, right? I think I gave the example of who was the poet? Walt Whitman. Was it Whitman? Yeah. Who's less concerned with logic. Actually, that's interesting. Walt Whitman has a wonderful poem, says, which is something like, I am a what is it? The contradiction. I am huge. I contain multitudes. Yes. That includes contradictions. Yeah, so what? Which is to say, I violate the law of non-contradiction, says Walt Whitman, the poet. Yeah. To which then he says, so much for your law of non-contradiction, Aristotle. It's like an FU to Aristotle, basically, which takes some cojones. Sorry for the language today. All right. And James wants to find a pragmatic middle ground between the tender and the tough-minded. And he thinks pragmatism is that middle ground.
Okay. So the example about the choices, I just wanted to understand. Being agnostic is considered a third choice of choosing one of the two.
Good. For James, being agnostic is having already chosen atheism in the same way that Stedman and Oprah have chosen not to get married. It's not like they're a third choice. You either get married, don't get married, or be open to marriage but not yet. No. They've chosen by not getting married. I don't like that analogy now, but agnosticism is I will withhold belief in for or against God. James says no. It's a forced option. You either believe in God or you don't. If you're an agnostic, you have chosen atheism. You just fail to see that. Like the guy at the precipice saying, I'll just wait and see if I get saved. Right? That is to have chosen death, even though you call it agnostic. Now, we may not agree with that. We may say, wait a minute, there really is still a third option. Right? We'll see this again with Pascal's wager. There truly is a third option. I can either believe in God, believe that God does not exist, or refrain from belief whatsoever. I don't know. And I can be in that state of confusion and doubt and have that as a legitimate option. And we just disagree with his conception in that case. Now, groundlessness of belief. I'm going to spend more time on textual analysis here than I am on the slides. This is on page 133. There's only a few pages. Norman Malcolm was a good friend of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, probably one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century. They were very good friends, and yet I cannot find, for the life of me, a picture of the two of them together. I don't know why. There just aren't any. There's a picture that Malcolm took of Wittgenstein. I believe that's it. Malcolm supposedly had taken that picture. So that's as close as I got to having them two together. This is Wittgenstein, 1889, 1951. Died of cancer in 1951. Wittgenstein published really only one work in his life. The work that's referenced in this text, Philosophical Investigations, was published after his death. And On Certainty was also published after his death. On Certainty was Wittgenstein's last writings. His Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Tractatus as it's sometimes called, he wrote that around 1921, the Tractatus, which is just a treatise on logic and philosophy. He wrote that, it was about 100 pages, 127 pages or so, and in it he basically says, wherein I have solved all the problems of philosophy. And then he went on to teach kindergarten. He was... And knowing that and knowing him with young students is a weird phenomenon because he was not good with kids. He's not good with students, actually. He was more of a loner and didn't like the whole idea of having to teach. He just wanted to think. Yeah.
He was eventually chased out of the town where he was.
He harmed a child.
Yeah.
He absolutely. There was a lawsuit. Yeah. There was a lawsuit. He threw body slammed the child ultimately.
He didn't understand geometry.
Yeah, geometry is important, but not that important. Anyway, I don't want to give you a negative connotation of his. That was one. That was just one kid. Okay, so there is. He did go to grammar school. I guess it would have been 3rd grade, 4th grade, maybe, with Adolf Hitler. Yeah, I don't know what. I'm not making anything of that. They didn't know each other. I mean, there's a picture. I don't have a picture of that, but you can see a picture of him in the same class as Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler's just sitting there like this. He's already an ass. You can tell that kid's going to be a Hitler. And he was. Anyway, Wittgenstein, totally different dude than Hitler, is referenced here. Wittgensteinian Fideism. It's a hell of a phrase. Fideism, do you remember what Fideism means? What's that? Yep.
It's okay to believe on institution things. Basically, it's a faith-based thing, and we read reason from religion instead to.
Right. In fact, reason doesn't play a role. Argumentation certainly doesn't play a role for the fideist. And I briefly touched on that before. What's wrong with argument? Wittgenstein, in his conversations with Norman Malcolm did a memoir of Wittgenstein. They talked quite often. Wittgenstein stayed at Norman Malcolm's home in Ithaca, New York for some time toward the end of his life. So he got to understand the man and understand his perspective. Wittgenstein was very much influenced with respect to his faith, which is unclear what his faith was, at least looking at his readings alone, but influenced by Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, famous for his fideistic approach, that it is not reason. Reason is the wrong tool to get to God. The analogy we gave before was something like using reason and logic to determine the health of your marriage. And in fact, there's a wonderful quote in here related to that. I think it was in here about using reason. No, it wasn't in this. It was actually from somewhere else, but I'll show it to you later. And there's a Kierkegaardian quote with respect to use of logic and reason to try to prove the existence of God. That actually pushes us away from God. As a fideist, we're to believe in God through faith. That leaves room for freedom. There's not a whole lot of discussion of freedom in this reading, which I think is important. And it may have been cut out, or it just wasn't there initially. And I think that may be an issue. What do I mean by freedom? Do you remember the discussion of fideism and one of the problems of it from the fideist perspective of grounding belief in anything, in particular religious belief, on argumentation, on reason? Let's imagine I have an argument for the existence of God, and that argument is compelling to me. It convinces me. In fact, it's so convincing, it would be irrational for me not to believe it. What am I getting at? Yes, but what is a problem for a believer in that mental state? Where here's an argument, wow, that argument is rational. I, as a rational being, am compelled to accept it. It's not choosing. There's no faith there anymore. If the argument succeeds, it compels us. Argument, reason compels us. Argument and reason is not the same thing as choice. We don't choose to say, if P then Q, P therefore Q. We don't choose that. We interpret that as valid. It is, by definition, it is a rational deductive proof. There's no freedom at all in that. And so, if argument succeeds, it gets rid of faith. And if we get rid of faith, because you don't have faith in argument, you don't have faith in a conclusion that follows with necessity, you are logically compelled to accept it. It's not a free choice. And so do you choose to believe in God? No. You believe in God because the claim God exists follows from premises. As obvious to you, let's say that there is a table in front of me. I don't choose to believe there's a table here. That's not how belief works. To go back to the secret, right? As to the skeptics, it's up to them to choose to believe. Interesting phrase. And we'll see again with Pascal. Can I choose to believe something? Or is belief a kind of mental state that's dependent upon how reality is and how it impinges upon me? This is fundamental to so many other areas of this class. When we look at stories about conversion, when we look at free will generally, and when we look at punishments and reward for belief, I shouldn't be punished for failing to believe something that reason tells me is not so. But I also shouldn't be rewarded for believing something that reason compels me to believe. Do you understand? Yep.
Is this kind of like the phrase, perception is reality, and that, the believer of the religion believes that, they can, I guess, in the extreme, get rid of cancer.
Oh, no. So that's the secret. That's perception is reality. That's will it and it will happen. That's ask for it. Get your positive thinking going toward that. Constantly focus on it. You'll get your BMW. You'll get your cure for cancer. That's not Wittgenstein. That's not Norman Malcolm. That's not William James either. It's not even Blaise Pascal, as we'll see. That is a sales pitch. That's what that was from Rhonda Byrne. Reality is perception is reality. There's too many different ways of going about that. Because James, on one interpretation of James, it sounds like that's what he's saying. I don't see that here. Let me try to get through Wittgenstein's conception of Fideism and Malcolm's interpretation of it before we go more into that question. Because I don't want to dismiss that. There's more to it. What is Malcolm talking about here? He's talking about belief generally first, as a kind of opening to get to Wittgenstein's conception of the groundlessness, or of Malcolm's conception of the groundlessness of belief in particular with respect to God. From the book, and I posted it, it's very short, it's 90 pages, it's suggested, don't have to read it of course, on certainty, in the section suggested readings. He says, if you tried to doubt everything, you would not get as far as doubting anything. The game of doubting presupposes certainty. And I like it that he puts it as a game. Because he says a lot about games. And he says a lot about rules and rule following. What's going on when we engage in a game? We are taking for granted. We are trusting that others are playing by the same rules. And rarely, and I don't want to say never, although he kind of implies never, do we question the rules. We just play it. And it's through trust that we're able to continue to do so. And any time I engage in doubting, there is some premise from which I am standing upon that enables me to question. I can't doubt the whole thing. I can't engage in what Descartes did, which is a kind of methodological or hyperbolic doubt, where I throw out everything and see what's left. How far can I go with my doubting? Wittgenstein is aware you can't do that. In fact, I don't know if he read Charles Sanders Peirce, the American pragmatist, but it sounds like he did. When Peirce says, you can't engage in the kind of doubting that Descartes suggested. That is merely paper doubt. Descartes, famous for those of you who are not familiar with Descartes, he tries to engage in a justification, a foundation for his belief systems. And he realizes that what he got from his parents, he can't trust. He can't trust what came from his teachers. He can't trust what came from his pastors. He needs to justify himself through argument, through rationality, a foundation of his belief. So he's going to throw out everything that he can conceivably doubt until he gets to a kernel that cannot be doubted. It would be a contradiction to doubt it, and that's where he's going to start from. Peirce says that's not possible. That's merely pretend doubt. That's not genuine doubt. Real doubt is a feeling of uncertainty. Real doubt is not actually having a sense of the truth in question. Peirce will give the example of the feeling you get when you're unsure whether the exam is today or the next day. Have you experienced that before? Is the test today? That feeling you get that sucks? That's genuine doubt. But in order to even have that, it presupposes some kind of grounding elsewhere. The way our belief system is set up, doubting is only possible if we presuppose some position from which to doubt. I doubt that claim is true. But in doing that, you're assuming some other claim that is the contradictory of that is true. So the doubt presupposes. This is what Wittgenstein is saying here. Go ahead.
So I was going to ask, what's his opinion on Socrates and the Socratic method then, if he doesn't believe, just wasn't that the general premise of what Socrates is doing? I don't know anything, no one knows anything, I'm going to try to find out.
So, first, Socrates was ironic. In fact, so ironic that we have a thing called Socratic irony. So I would be cautious in interpreting Socrates' claim that the only thing I know is that I know nothing in an absolute sense. Socrates was aware of the self-refutation of that sentence. The only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing. If that's true, that you know nothing, and that sentence is true, then you know something. Namely, that you know nothing, which means you know something, which means it's false that you know nothing. That just takes you back around in circles. I think what Socrates was referring to there is wisdom for him is recognizing one's limitations, recognizing where one is ignorant. And that's at least part of it. But the Socratic questioning, I don't think would be undermined. Wittgenstein would disagree, though, that there are absolutes. So if we take Socrates and Plato as having similar views, for them, there is the unchangeable realm of the forms. And the philosopher who achieves that dialectical movement to get to those forms, those unchanging archetypes, has access to certainty, absolute certainty. I don't know that Wittgenstein would...
Questioning, right? I mean, that's the idea, right? They reached that realm by questioning.
Yeah. And Wittgenstein has no trouble with that. You can question, in fact, let me jump to that. You certainly can question within what Wittgenstein will call a language game. And he speaks of games all the time. From within the language game, I might question this or that particular rule. While we're in it, we're using that system. But there's always going to be some unquestioned presupposition, unargued for, unjustified, groundless presupposition that's allowing us to ask questions to begin with. The system, and this is the best I can come up with. Untestable presuppositions behind any system of thought. And I thought of Aristotle and his laws of thinking, the law of non-contradiction in particular. This, Aristotle says, cannot be, much less is it, supported by any rational means. It is groundless in that it is the basis, it is the ground for all thinking. That's why they call it the laws of thought. Law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, they're basically, logically they entail each other. I don't need to get into those now. I can't have, what does Aristotle say? It's not the case that I can have, I'll clarify it. I could not exist and not exist at the same time. That's a contradiction. A claim is either true or false. It is not both. And the law of identity is a basic principle in logic. A equals A. It is self-identical. It is what's known as a tautology. There are some negatives of that, but we won't talk about those here. These are presupposed. They're not argued for. They are the ground, so to speak, of thinking as such. But that's an odd way of putting it. There's nothing that holds them up. Because typically in philosophy, as Malcolm points out in page 134, he talks about evidentialism. In our Western Academy, academic philosophy, religious belief is commonly regarded as unreasonable and is viewed with condescension or even contempt. It is said that religion is a refuge for those who, because of weakness of the intellect or character, are unable to confront the stern realities of the world. The objective, mature, strong attitude is to hold beliefs solely on the basis of evidence. Evidentialism. James's tough-mindedness. That's Clifford, evidentialist. But then he goes on the other page, 135. One of the primary pathologies, the first column of 135 in the middle, one of the primary pathologies of philosophy is the feeling that we must justify our language games. We want to establish them as well-grounded. But we should consider Wittgenstein's remark that a language game is not based on grounds. It is there, like our life. In logic, actually let me skip here. So we have the images. And I guess that's where we're going to go. In logic, we want to say our conclusion is held up. We have an opinion. We turn that opinion into a conclusion when we give reasons for it. And the reasons we call premises. If this premise is true and it's logically connected to my opinion here, my conclusion follows. This premise grounds the conclusion. It supports it. Somebody might ask, well, is P true? P stands for whatever you wish. Claim, premise. How do I know that P is true? It's held up by that claim. P holds up P, which holds up C. And then there's another one. You can number these, of course. You would number our premises. You see where the problem might go. What if we have an infinite regress of these premises? It seems that way leads to skepticism. That way leads to the impossibility of knowledge. We cannot get to a grounding, the skeptic says, of any of our claims, because there's no ultimate grounding that is not itself in need of support. In Wittgenstein's language, we can reason logically within the game of argumentation. The argument for flat earthers versus the argument for non-flat earthers. What do they call it?
Rounders.
Normies? Rounders?
Yeah.
Roundies?
Yep.
No, they're not. Is it really? Okay. But the arguments for the spherical nature of the Earth, of the planet, are superior to the arguments for the claim that the Earth is flat. We can figure that out within the game of logic. But you might ask, what grounds logic? What holds up the system? Let's say these are different arguments within the game of logic. What holds up, what grounds the rules of the game of logic itself? Do you see? The same thing can be said for language as well. He references this, the same page, 135, as Wittgenstein says, it is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. We cannot explain this agreement by saying that we are just doing what the rules tell us. For our agreement in applying rules, formulae, and signposts is what gives them their meaning. And he goes on further. Within a language game, there is justification and lack of justification. We were just talking about that. There's evidence, there's proof, there's mistakes, and groundless opinions. Good and bad reasoning, and correct measurements, and incorrect ones. One cannot properly apply these terms to a language game itself. It may, however, be said to be groundless. Not in the sense of a groundless opinion, but in the sense that we accept it, we live it. We can say, this is what we do, this is how we are. That sounds very interesting. It's what Wittgenstein calls a form of life, which to Wittgenstein is the habituated, enculturated rules, for example, of a language community. How do we get these rules? We learn them. They're taught to us. But the rules run out. How do we then move beyond that? The grounds, the justifications run out, he says.
What does that mean, to run out?
I don't know. Other than to say, I followed this rule up to this point, and now I realize another mathematical problem, another
That's just kind of what you put there, right?
particular issue. How do I extend what I learned from those previous rules? Now I've gone past them. My education, my training was in the past. Now, what am I doing? Am I still following rules? What's happening here? What's grounding my action? Let me see if it makes sense. He says, to say further, where is it? See if this analogy makes sense. Page 135, second column at the bottom. The obsessive concern with proofs. Here he's dealing with religious proofs, religious ideas. and arguments for God's existence. The obsessive concern with the proofs reveals the assumption that in order for religious belief to be intellectually respectable, it ought to have a rational justification. On the face of it, yeah, that sounds right. Certainly what Clifford says. But he says then, that is the misunderstanding. Tell me if you like this analogy. It is like the idea that we are not justified in relying on memory until memory has been proved reliable. Put another way, arguing inductively using causal arguments. Using causal arguments, by that I mean like the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, makes the case that, the coronavirus was caused by activity at this particular place, at this particular time, by human interactions with these particular animal species. Now, we can't know that with certainty because we're relying upon a causal, inductive inference. The tobacco industry pushed this line, telling us you can't know for sure that tobacco causes cancer. And they were right. But they were only right because causal arguments, the kind that we were using to demonstrate the causal relation between smoking and cancer, are inductive. And no inductive argument provides you with certainty. Inductive arguments provide you with probability. But we might say they are the best form of reasoning we have to expand our base of knowledge. The question then asked is, well, how do I know that induction is a proper mode of evaluation, a proper method of logical inference? What can I use to justify the methods of induction? You wouldn't want to say, induction, because that's circular. How do you know induction works? Because induction reveals to us patterns and a kind of uniformity in nature. And how do you know there's uniformity in nature and these patterns? Because we rely on induction to tell us. How do we escape that circle? Within induction, we can make inferences. But to justify induction as such, as a field of study, as a discipline, as a mode of reasoning, we can't use the very thing in question. That'd be like saying, how is this building held up? What grounds this building? Nothing. It floats. It's floating by itself.
So what exactly do they mean when they say that science is also a form of life and that's groundless?
Very good.
There's no justification for why these things work or why science is a thing.
So this is where, when I said I don't know what he means by when the rules run out, I think the connection he tries to make with chemistry. Is it chemistry?
Yeah.
The groundlessness of religious belief. Religion is a form of life. It is a language embedded in action. Wittgenstein calls it a language game. Science is another. Neither stands in need of justification, the one no more than the other. In this case, it sounds like that's just being stated. But if induction itself is a kind of form of life, a game, where we don't really question the rules, at least that's what he says. We don't really question the rules, which I find to be an odd statement. One cannot properly apply these terms to a language game itself. We can within a language game evaluate what these words mean. We can within the system of the game of logic evaluate one inductive argument against another inductive argument, but we can't go outside of induction to evaluate induction itself. We can't go outside of science, the assumption here is, to evaluate science itself. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with sports? When you're playing a game, you trust that there are rules, and you don't question the rules. You play by the rules, and it's just accepted. But is it true that you never question the rules of the game that you're playing? My son is playing handball at school, and the number of rules in this game has increased over the days, such that people are confused. The teachers there said, all right, kids, we all have to come together and have a meeting about handball and all of the rules. It's gotten too complex. And they debated, 7-year-olds, they debated about what the rules of handball should be. Can you do it across the world? No. Can you do no kixies? Kixie, I don't know. He tries to teach me these rules. There's a lot of rules, and they're questioning them within. You watch soccer now. They got these new rules of the VAR. Who watches soccer? Oh my God! Nobody watches the English Premier League a little bit, where they in football they have the what's that called? Replay that they can go look at and see if they can recall a call. No, instant replay. Yes. But in soccer, they didn't have that. The referee would be to determine what's happened. Now there's a new rule that if it's close, they can go back to VAR. I can't remember what that means. And they can change what's happened in the game. The game's rules are changing. It seems as if we're outside of it and questioning it. It doesn't seem obvious that Malcolm's conception of Wittgenstein's form of life is as unquestionable and groundless as he makes it. Don't we want reasons for the rules? I mean, I questioned rules all the time when I was in high school. We have to wear a uniform. Those are the rules. But why? Who decided those rules? What's the benefit of the rules? And I never got any answers. I would just get detentions, penance halls. And they wouldn't tell me, the reason for these uniforms is so that high school kids don't make fun of the other high school kids for having silly looking clothes or whatever. Right? Because kids will do that. They'll make fun of you if your clothes are like this. But if we all look the same, you can't make fun of. Look at you with your corduroy. Yeah, we're all wearing corduroy. What's wrong with you? But they never tell me that. That's a pretty decent justification. Is that not a justification? A grounding for that rule? I guess then Wittgenstein could ask, but why that? Eventually, the justifications run out.
Could you maybe try to tie that theory in with like something like climate change and like the perceived ending of the planet in some ways? It's like what would this philosopher say about that? If science is so groundless, what do science observations about the planet around us tell us, even if everything is burning?
Well, let me just clarify, and I did, speaking of which, there is, for next time, Pascal's Wager and Climate Change. There's a relevant suggested reading. It's short. That is available to you now. I'd read that alongside the Pascal reading. But I think to that, Wittgenstein would say, as Malcolm has it put, within each, there are advances, recession, insight. There are errors, there are mistakes within the science. So if I appeal to my experience in the world and I say, I'm seeing all the same things that the scientists are seeing, I'm just deriving different conclusions. I think Australia's burning for other reasons than climate science. Well, I could be mistaken. And when 97.8% of climate scientists agree that there is climate change happening, and it's caused by human activities, their arguments are probably more likely going to be superior. This is not to say they're automatically right, but experts in a field are more prone to get things correct in that field than non-experts. I'm not an expert in climate science. I would defer to those experts. There can be mistakes within those fields. Some scientists can be mistaken. The scientist, the doctor, forgotten his name, who wrote the paper connecting autism spectrum with MMR shot back in 1998. He was a doctor. He was in the field of science, and he published in a very prestigious journal, The Lancet, that there was a causal connection between the two. He was mistaken. It's not he questioned the grounds of science as such within the realm of medicine, this particular science. He had made a mistake. In fact, he had cheated, basically. He had fudged the data, and his data had not been replicable. So we can say within that language game, within that game of chemistry, of medicine, whatever, there is justification and lack of justification. There is evidence and proof, mistakes, groundless opinions, good and bad reasoning. But, he argues, you can't question outside of that the grounds or benefits of science itself. And I don't know that that's true. Yep.
I was trying to make the connection between science and religion, and I think just like probably most of us in this room would say we believe in science, and because of, and the science, if there's any scientists here, we study these equations and we understand these theories and how they understand, but it's good to question and to like understand our own. So I think the same is true with religion. It's probably not true that every one of us in this room believe in some sort of religion, but if you do like accept the premise God exists, but then you do question the rules, and like from there, I think it is, I mean, there is like a set way, like in science, the equations,
Oh, I
the
see
way
what you're
that you
saying.
do things, there's a set way. So like in religion, there's rules, like you're supposed to do this,
I
and
see.
you're not supposed to do this. And I don't think it's good to blindly follow those but to understand like from ourselves and understand like why these rules are the way that they are, and then maybe you'll see like they do bring more freedom instead of restriction.
Well, when you mentioned that, initially you talked about faith in, I think you said faith in science. And that's a term that's used here too on page 134 at the bottom, first column. He's quoting from Wittgenstein. For our acceptances to have been withheld would have meant that we had not learned how to count, how to measure, how to use names, to play games, or even to talk. We start with trust, not rational justification. Wittgenstein remarks that, quote, a language game is only possible if one trusts something, end quote. Not can, but does trust something. I think he means by this trust or acceptance what he calls belief in the sense of religious belief. So trust and faith are different, aren't they? We might say, I trust, and we talked a little bit about this with science and religion earlier. We'll wrap this up here. I trust the scientific method. To say you have faith in it implies something different. And there you get to that distinction we discussed before. I have inductive inferences based on previous experiences that gives me the capacity to trust that my wife is not cheating on me. But I also want to say I have faith in her, right? I trust the scientific method, I have faith in my wife. That goes back to your earlier example of human relationships. And maybe that's where science is the wrong tool. And maybe even psychology is the wrong tool as part of the field of science to get at human nature. Science gives us trust in certain things, but we need a different tool if we're going to be dealing with human beings that are more prone to and better off engaging with something closer to faith, which we'll have to say more of next time. I only have a few more things to say about the Malcolm reading, and then we're on to Pascal's very short work, and then there's the suggested reading. Your quiz, forgot to mention. Online, you'll see here quiz 2. It should pop up on the side of your screen as well. It doesn't have to be done by tonight. You have until next class, right before class begins, but you also have a discussion reflection due, so you want to get those done, time it well. Here's the question. Give a brief critique of Cliffordian evidentialism from the standpoint of Wittgensteinian Fideism as presented by Norman Malcolm. That sounds weird, but you all get it. You know what I just said. Isn't that cool? Anyway, do you agree with Malcolm's perspective and explain? That's what we just covered. So that's no more than a page. That's the quiz, the individual you'll do and submit online through there. But you also have kind of reflection, discussion questions on the Pascal reading where you pick one of those questions at the end of the reading to submit online. All right, I'll see you all. I trust I will see you all on Thursday. I'm kidding. I know. I will see you all. Yes.
I sure would.
We